August 2018, Tampa, Florida. A mother waded into the Hillsborough River with her 4-year-old daughter in her arms. Within moments, the child vanished beneath the water as onlookers stood frozen in disbelief. This was not an accident. It was a tragedy that would horrify a community and capture national attention. In the summer of 2018, Tampa, Florida, was like any other American city moving through its daily rhythms. Families filled the parks, workers hurried to offices, and children played in the long, humid evenings. Life in Tampa was, for many, ordinary and predictable. But on one August afternoon, a crime so disturbing and unimaginable would break the pattern of that summer, sending ripples of shock and disbelief across the community and far beyond. This was the day that a 26-year-old woman named Shakayla Denson took her 4-year-old daughter, Jahira Daniels, to the Hillsborough River and committed an act that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, one has to step back into the world of the young mother and her child. Shakayla was a woman in her mid-20s, raising her daughter largely on her own. Friends and relatives later described her as someone who often looked overwhelmed, caught between the demands of parenthood and her own internal battles. She was unemployed at the time and struggling with financial difficulties, but her challenges were not only about money. Shakayla had been living with personal stress and mental health struggles for years, many of which were never properly treated or managed. For a young mother, the pressures were heavy, and those closest to her noticed she sometimes seemed distant, disconnected, and troubled. Her daughter, Jahira, was a lively little girl, full of the energy that defines early childhood. She was only 4 years old, barely old enough to understand the world around her. Jahira had been diagnosed with autism, a condition that meant she needed extra patience, care, and attention. For many families, raising a child with special needs requires more support than one parent alone can provide. But in Shakayla's case, she was often isolated, navigating her role as mother and caretaker without the resources or emotional balance she needed. On August 2, 2018, the day began like any other in Tampa. But for Shakayla Denson, it would unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. That afternoon, she arrived at an auto repair shop. A gray Nissan Altima was left running outside by mechanics who had been working on it. Shakayla, for reasons that remain unclear, made a sudden decision. She entered the car, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away. Witnesses at the shop were startled, reporting what they had seen to the authorities. For Shakayla, however, the stolen vehicle was not the end goal. It was only the beginning of a series of actions that would lead her and her daughter toward the Hillsborough River. She drove the car through the streets of Tampa, the hot Florida sun beating down as the hours crept forward. In the back seat was little Jahira, innocent and unaware of what was about to happen. What thoughts passed through Shakayla's mind as she drove remain unknown, but it is clear that something in her had reached a breaking point. Eventually, she reached the area near the river, a spot not far from downtown Tampa. The Hillsborough River runs through the heart of the city, a place familiar to locals for fishing, boating, and scenic walks. On this day, it would become the setting for a tragedy. Witnesses later recalled seeing Shakayla step out of the stolen Nissan with her daughter. She carried Jahira in her arms, walking steadily toward the riverbank. The sight must have seemed unusual, but not alarming, at least not at first. A mother with her child near the water could appear entirely normal. But then, the situation shifted. Without hesitation, Shakayla stepped into the river. Still holding Jahira, she waded deeper and deeper into the water. Eyewitnesses stood frozen, unsure if what they were seeing was an accident, an act of confusion, or something far worse. The river was calm that day, but its depth was unforgiving. By the time Shakayla reached chest-high water, the onlookers realized that what was happening was not ordinary. And then came the moment that would forever mark this case. Shakayla let go of her daughter. Little Jahira struggled in the water, her small arms flailing, her head bobbing as she tried to stay afloat. She was only 4 years old, far too young to swim or save herself. Those watching from the shore could see the desperate fight of a child against the river's current, and they could see the mother turning away. Witnesses shouted, panicked, and some called 911. But in those seconds, the river consumed the little girl. She disappeared beneath the surface. For the onlookers, the scene was unbearable. They rushed to alert police and emergency responders. Calls went out urgently, describing a child submerged in the Hillsborough River. Divers and rescue teams were sent immediately. Within less than an hour, J.E. Hira's body was recovered from the water. She was rushed to a local hospital, but the outcome was devastating. Doctors pronounced her dead. Her young life ended before it had even truly begun. The turning point of this story was that moment in the water, the act of a mother releasing her own child into the river. For those who were there, the image of J.E. Hira slipping under the surface would remain seared in memory. And for the community, the news spread quickly, bringing with it a mixture of sorrow, disbelief, and anger. Meanwhile, Shakayla Denson did not flee. She emerged from the water, walked back to the shore, and remained in the area. When police officers arrived at the scene, they found her wet from the river. They arrested her the same day. The charges would come swiftly, reflecting the seriousness of the crime: first-degree felony murder, aggravated child abuse, and grand theft auto. In the hours that followed, Tampa reeled from the shock. How could a mother harm her own child? How could a young woman of only 26 commit an act so unthinkable? The questions had no simple answers. For many, the story was too painful to even process. Strangers left flowers near the riverbank in memory of Vivera. Community leaders called for compassion, but also for justice. The case became national news. Headlines described the horrifying scene, and images of the river were shown across television screens. The story was more than a crime. It was a tragedy that raised questions about mental health, the pressures of single motherhood, and the fragile boundary between desperation and violence. As the investigation began, authorities focused on piecing together the hours and days leading up to the drowning. They interviewed witnesses from the auto repair shop, who confirmed Shakayla had stolen the Nissan Altima earlier that day. They spoke to bystanders who had seen her in the river, and they began to examine her history, looking for explanations, motives, or warning signs. The weight of the crime was clear from the beginning. A child had been lost in the most unnatural of ways. A mother, who should have been her protector, had instead become the cause of her death. And the Hillsborough River, once a place of leisure and calm, was now forever associated with the memory of a little girl's final moments. In the hours after Shakayla Denson was taken into custody, Tampa was shaken. News spread quickly about what had happened at the Hillsborough River. For people who lived nearby, the sight of police tape around the riverbank and divers searching the waters was enough to make them stop in disbelief. For others who heard it on the evening news, the story sounded almost unreal. A young mother, only 26 years old, had walked into the water with her little girl and let her go. The child had drowned, and the mother had been arrested on the spot. The case quickly drew the attention of law enforcement officials, social service workers, and the community at large. Investigators began piecing together mother and daughter to the scene of the drowning. Meanwhile, witnesses who had been near the river gave their statements. Several people described seeing Denson wade into the water, holding her child. They explained how she walked until the water reached her chest, and then released J.E. Hira. These witnesses described their feelings of horror and helplessness as the little girl disappeared under the surface. Some shouted for help, others called emergency services, but none were able to reach the child in time. Their testimonies painted a picture of a tragic scene that unfolded in broad daylight, with strangers powerless to intervene. As police processed the crime scene, Denson was booked into custody. Her charges were serious: first-degree felony murder, aggravated child abuse, and grand theft auto. To the public, the case was already shocking, but the legal terminology confirmed the severity of what had occurred. The charge of first-degree felony murder indicated that the state was treating the death of J.E. Hira as intentional and connected to other criminal acts, including the car theft. In the days that followed, more details about Shakayla's background came to light. She had grown up in Florida, lived in Tampa, and had her daughter Jaihira at a young age. Friends and acquaintances described her as someone who often seemed burdened, a young woman who was trying but struggling to manage the responsibilities of motherhood. She was not employed at the time of the crime, and records showed that she had been dealing with financial hardships. Those who knew her also pointed to her mental health, saying she sometimes appeared withdrawn or unstable. Jaihira, on the other hand, was remembered as a sweet and energetic little girl. At 4 years old, she was just beginning to explore the world. Her diagnosis of autism meant that she required extra care and patience, something that placed added demands on her mother. Family members described Jaihira as a child who loved to play, who laughed easily, and who had so much life ahead of her. The loss was devastating not only because of how it happened, but because of how young she was and how much potential was cut short. The community's reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. People left flowers, toys, and stuffed animals near the Hillsborough River as a memorial for Jaihira. Vigils were held, and prayers were offered for the child whose life had ended so tragically. For many in Tampa, the river now carried a heavy association with grief. Community leaders spoke about the importance of supporting struggling parents and the need for greater awareness of mental health resources. At the same time, many called for accountability, demanding that justice be served for the little girl who had no voice to defend herself. Media outlets across the country picked up the story. Headlines described the crime in stark detail, and television broadcasts replayed images of the Hillsborough River, rescue divers, and Shakayla being led away by police. The case quickly became national news, sparking debates about mental health, single motherhood, and the responsibilities of the state to protect vulnerable children. For those outside of Florida, the story was shocking. For those in Tampa, it was personal. As the legal process began, Denson appeared in court for her initial hearings. She stood before the judge, charged with crimes that carried the possibility of a lifetime in prison. Her public appearances were closely followed by reporters and community members alike. In those early hearings, questions about her mental state became central. Her attorneys argued that her actions were tied to mental illness, suggesting that she had been suffering from significant psychological distress when she entered the river with her daughter. Prosecutors, however, maintained the gravity of the charges, pointing to the deliberate nature of her actions. The court ordered evaluations of Denson's mental health. These evaluations were important, as they would determine whether she was competent to stand trial and what role her mental state might have played in the crime. Reports indicated that she had a history of struggles, but the details remained private within the legal system. For the public, the question of why she had done what she did remained unanswered. While the case moved slowly through the courts, the community continued to mourn Jaihira. For months after her death, flowers and stuffed animals appeared at the site along the river. Neighbors and strangers alike felt the weight of the tragedy. The child had become a symbol of innocence lost, and her story served as a reminder of the fragility of life. The prosecution worked steadily to build its case. With eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and the stolen vehicle, they had a clear chain of events leading to the drowning. The defense, meanwhile, focused on Denson's mental health, hoping to reduce the severity of the charges or shift the narrative away from premeditation. Court documents revealed arguments about whether she had intended to kill her daughter or whether her actions were the result of an unstable mind. As months turned into years, the case wound its way through the legal system. Each hearing, each filing, and each statement was closely followed by the press. Community members who had once been shocked now grew accustomed to hearing the names Shakayla Denson and Jaihira Daniels in the news, though the emotional impact never faded. For Jaihira's extended family, the process was agonizing. They attended hearings, listened to the arguments, and waited for a resolution. The case also highlighted broader issues. Mental health advocates pointed out that Denson's struggles might have gone unnoticed or untreated, raising the question of whether tragedy could have been prevented with earlier intervention. Child welfare advocates emphasized the importance of monitoring vulnerable families and ensuring children with special needs had the support systems they required. For some, The story was not only about one mother and one child, but about gaps in a system that should have provided more protection. Yet through all these discussions, the simple, painful fact remained. A 4-year-old child had lost her life. No argument, no analysis, and no courtroom debate could change that outcome. The Hillsborough River, which had once been just a feature of the city, had become the place where an unimaginable act occurred, and it remained a symbol of grief for Tampa. By the time the trial process gained momentum, the case had already left a lasting mark. Shakayla Denson was a name that many would never forget, not because of her life story, but because of what she had done on that August day. The courtroom became the next stage for this story, where the events of August 2nd, 2018, would be examined in detail, argued over, and judged. As the years passed after the drowning of 4-year-old Vihira Daniels, the case of her mother, Shakayla Denson, remained in the public eye. It was not the kind of story that faded quickly. Instead, it lingered, reopening pain with every new court date or headline. For the community of Tampa, the image of the Hillsborough River and the memory of that August afternoon continued to represent a loss that was difficult to make sense of. But in the courtroom, the process of seeking justice moved steadily forward. Shakayla Denson faced some of the most serious charges possible in the state of Florida. From the beginning, she had been charged with first-degree felony murder, aggravated child abuse, and grand theft auto. These charges reflected the full sequence of events: stealing the Nissan Altima, walking into the river with her child, and ultimately allowing Vihira to drown. Prosecutors were clear. This was not only a crime, but one of the gravest acts a person could commit: the killing of a child by her own parent. The weight of the law stood firmly against her. The courtroom proceedings became a slow and difficult journey. Every appearance brought back memories of the crime for the witnesses who had seen it unfold, for the first responders who had pulled Vihira from the water, and for the family members who had lost her. Each hearing was an emotional reminder of what had been taken. The defense attorneys worked to present a picture of Shakayla as a troubled young woman, someone whose mental health struggles played a central role in her actions. The prosecution, meanwhile, emphasized the deliberate steps she had taken that day: stealing a car, driving to the river, carrying her child into the water, and letting her go. As testimony and evidence were examined, it became clear that mental health would be at the core of the defense. Psychologists and evaluators studied Shakayla, looking for answers about her state of mind on August 2nd, 2018. Reports suggested that she had lived with long-standing emotional and psychological difficulties, though the details were closely guarded by the court. Her attorneys argued that she was not in control of herself, that her actions came from a place of deep instability rather than cold intent. This argument, while powerful to some, did not erase the fact that a child was gone. For the public, the trial raised painful questions. Was Shakayla a criminal fully responsible for her actions, or was she a deeply troubled individual who had reached a breaking point? Could the law account for mental illness in a case where the crime was so stark and irreversible? And for Vihira's family, did the reasons even matter when their little girl would never return? Courtrooms often strip stories down to their essential facts, and this case was no different. The stolen Nissan, the river, the moment when Shakayla let go of her daughter, witness statements, police reports, medical examiners confirming the cause of death as drowning. These were the pieces of the case, presented with precision, and they formed a story that was impossible to deny. Years went by as the case moved through hearings and legal motions. It was not until 2022, for years after the drowning, that the final resolution arrived. Facing the possibility of life in prison if convicted of first-degree murder, Shakayla Denson entered a plea. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a lesser but still grave charge. With this plea, the trial that might have stretched further into the future came to an end. The agreement spared her from the most severe sentence, but it ensured that she would serve significant time in prison. The sentencing hearing was another emotional moment. The courtroom filled with quiet tension as the judge announced the outcome. Shakayla Denson was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She would serve her time in a Florida correctional facility. For her, it meant 2 decades behind bars. For Jehira's family, it meant a measure of justice, though not closure. The loss of a child is something that no sentence, no legal outcome, can ever make right. The confession and sentencing marked the end of a legal battle, but the story did not end there. The case left scars on everyone connected to it. For the bystanders who had seen a little girl slip beneath the surface of the Hillsborough River, the memory would remain for the rest of their lives. For the police officers and divers who pulled her from the water, the image of her lifeless body was one of the haunting costs of their work. For Jehira's extended family, every birthday, every holiday, and every milestone was a reminder of the child who was no longer there. The community, too, felt the impact. The Hillsborough River became more than just a local landmark. It became a place associated with loss. Even years later, people would recall the tragedy when they walked its banks or crossed its bridges. Flowers had once been left there in memory of Jehira, and though time had passed, the story remained a part of Tampa's collective memory. On a larger scale, the case sparked conversations about mental health, especially for young mothers raising children under pressure. Advocates pointed out that Shakayla's struggles may have been signs of a person in crisis, someone who needed help but never received it. Could more support from mental health services have prevented what happened? Could better systems for identifying parents in distress have saved Jehira? These questions, though they could not change the past, were raised again and again in the aftermath. There was also a wider reflection on the role of society in protecting children with special needs. Jehira, a 4-year-old with autism, needed more than just ordinary care. She needed extra patience, resources, and stability. Advocates for children asked whether systems had failed her by not recognizing the difficulties her mother faced, and whether more attention to the family's situation could have prevented the tragedy. For many, however, the case was simply a devastating reminder of how fragile life is and how quickly it can be lost. The theme that ran through it all was one of desperation, mental struggle, and irreversible choice. A young mother, overwhelmed and untreated in her battles, had taken her child's life. A little girl, full of innocence and potential, had been robbed of her future. And a community had been left to make sense of something senseless. When Shakayla Denson entered prison, the legal chapter closed, but the story continued to live on in retellings, documentaries, and public memory. It was a case that carried every element of tragedy: a young mother, a vulnerable child, a shocking crime, and a painful resolution. It was a story that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about mental health, family support, and the thin line between personal hardship and catastrophe. In a quiet Georgia suburb, a hidden nightmare unfolded. A little girl just 10 years old, wasted away behind closed doors while the world carried on outside. This is the haunting case of Imani Moss, abuse, neglect, and betrayal that ended in the most unthinkable way. The story of Imani Gabrielle Moss begins in Lawrenceville, Georgia, a suburban community not far from Atlanta. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary place for families to raise their children, a town filled with apartments, quiet neighborhoods, and schools where children played and learned. But for Imani, who was born in 2003, this environment would not be a safe one. Instead, it became the setting of years of abuse and neglect that ultimately cost her life. From an early age, Imani's home was filled with instability and violence. Her father, Iman Moss, struggled with his temper and was known to lash out in anger. In 2004, when Imani was just a baby, police arrested Iman for battering her biological mother. That early act of violence was a warning sign of what kind of environment this young girl would be growing up in. It revealed not only the father's troubled behavior, but also foreshadowed the failures of a system meant to protect children like Imani. Not long after that arrest, Iman Moss married Tiffany Moss, a woman who worked occasionally as a preschool teacher's aide. Tiffany would later become the central figure in Imani's suffering. Over time, Tiffany would emerge as the primary abuser, using starvation, isolation, and cruelty as weapons against her stepdaughter. Tiffany and Iman eventually had 2 biological children together. While those children received care, food, and attention, Imani would be singled out, treated differently, and subjected to relentless punishment. The first documented sign of Tiffany's abusive nature came in 2010. By then, Imani was around 6 or 7 years old. One day, Tiffany decided to punish the child in an unthinkable way. She poured hot oatmeal on Imani, burning her skin. The cruelty was so severe that it drew the attention of law enforcement. Tiffany was arrested for child cruelty and brought before the courts. This was an opportunity for the system to intervene, to protect Imani, and to remove her from an unsafe home. Instead, Tiffany was given probation. She did not serve jail time, and after a brief period, Child Protective Services returned Imani to the custody of Tiffany and her father. This decision would later be viewed as one of the critical failures that allowed the abuse to continue. Once back in the home, the neglect escalated. Tiffany had her own children to care for and nurture, but when it came to Imani, she showed nothing but disdain. Witnesses would later describe how Imani was denied food on a regular basis, forced to stay in her room for long periods, and left out of family activities. At mealtimes, Tiffany made it clear that Imani was not welcome at the table. While the rest of the family ate, Imani often went hungry. At school, teachers and staff began to notice the consequences. Imani appeared extremely thin for her age, her body showing signs of malnourishment. Concerned educators made reports and raised alarms. But despite these warnings, the system once again failed to step in decisively. Instead, Tiffany and Iman found a way to avoid outside scrutiny. Tiffany decided to withdraw Imani from school, claiming she would homeschool her. By doing so, she effectively cut off the one place where Imani's suffering had been noticed. Without school staff keeping an eye on her, Imani became even more isolated, invisible to the outside world. For the next few years, the neglect deepened. Tiffany treated her biological children as though they belonged, while Imani was increasingly treated as a burden. Prosecutors would later argue that Tiffany wanted Imani out of the picture, and everything about her behavior supported that conclusion. By 2013, Imani's condition had grown dire. She was only 10 years old, yet her small frame had wasted away under years of mistreatment. Inside the Lawrenceville apartment, she was kept out of sight. Neighbors rarely saw her, and when family members asked about her, Tiffany and Iman offered excuses about her health. They misled others, suggesting Imani was unwell or had problems that explained her appearance. Behind those closed doors, Imani was fighting a losing battle. Deprived of basic nutrition, her body grew weaker by the day. While Tiffany and Iman cared for their other 2 children, feeding them, sending them to school, and allowing them to live normally, Imani was essentially left to die in silence. The last months of her life were particularly cruel. Locked away, denied meals, and excluded from normal family life, she became little more than a shadow inside her own home. The apartment, which should have been a place of safety and care, became a prison where Imani's suffering was hidden from the world. In October 2013, the abuse reached its tragic conclusion. Imani Moss, at just 10 years old, succumbed to the starvation that Tiffany had inflicted on her. At the time of her death, she weighed only 32 pounds, a weight more typical of a preschool-age child, not a girl entering adolescence. Her frail body told the story of years of neglect and deliberate cruelty. But even in death, Tiffany and Iman chose deception over accountability. Rather than seeking help or admitting what had happened, they attempted to cover up the crime. According to investigators, Tiffany insisted on disposing of the body in a way that would eliminate evidence. She and Iman placed Imani's remains inside a metal trash can and tried to set it on fire. The plan was gruesome, meant to destroy all traces of what they had done. Neighbors noticed the smoke and grew suspicious. Calls were made, and soon police were at the scene. The discovery of Imani's burned remains would shatter the community and begin an investigation that revealed the years of abuse she had endured. For many, the case was almost too painful to comprehend. How could a 10-year-old child waste away inside her own home without intervention? How could multiple warnings from teachers and a prior arrest for child cruelty still lead to this outcome? These questions would haunt both the investigators and the community of Lawrenceville as the case unfolded. Imani's short life had been marked by moments where the system could have saved her. When her father was arrested in 2004, when Tiffany was arrested in 2010, when teachers raised alarms at school, each of these moments represented a chance to intervene. But each time, the opportunities slipped away. What remained was a heartbreaking truth. Despite being surrounded by adults who should have cared for her, despite being part of a system designed to protect vulnerable children, Imani was left alone in her suffering. By the time authorities discovered her remains in that trash can, the horror of her final days was undeniable. This young girl had endured years of cruelty that no child should ever face. And while the investigation would eventually lead to justice, in that moment, what stood out most was the devastating cost of unchecked abuse and neglect. The case of Tiffany Moss and the murder of Imani Moss was now fully in motion. Investigators began piecing together the timeline, speaking with Iman, examining the evidence, and preparing for what would become one of Georgia's most disturbing trials. But before justice could be delivered, the world needed to understand the depth of cruelty that had been hidden behind the closed doors of a Lawrenceville apartment. The discovery of Imani Moss's remains in October 2013 sent shockwaves through the Lawrenceville community. Police officers who responded to the scene of the burning trash could hardly believe what they had found. It was not just the tragic death of a child, but the way her life had ended, starvation, neglect, and a desperate attempt to cover it up, that made the case particularly horrifying. As investigators began their work, they immediately turned their attention to the apartment where Imani had lived with her father, Iman Moss, and stepmother, Tiffany Moss. Inside, they found a home that seemed, on the surface, ordinary. There were toys, clothing, and evidence of family life. Yet there were also troubling signs of division, of a household where one child was treated differently from the others. While Tiffany and Iman's two biological children appeared well cared for, Imani's room told another story. Her space lacked comfort, and investigators would later describe an environment that was sparse, almost prison-like, a place where a young girl had been isolated and denied the nurturing every child needs. Neighbors recalled rarely seeing Imani. While the other children were visible, playing outside or going about their routines, Imani was kept hidden. When people asked about her, Tiffany or Iman would offer vague explanations. They claimed she was sick or that she was being homeschooled because of issues at school. At the time, some accepted these explanations. But in the aftermath of her death, it became clear that those excuses were part of a pattern of lies designed to cover up abuse. Investigators pieced together Imani's final months. She had been pulled out of school under the pretense of homeschooling. In reality, this decision allowed Tiffany to cut her off from teachers and administrators who had once raised concerns. For years, educators had noticed Imani's thin appearance and had made reports to child services. But those reports had not resulted in permanent removal from the home. Now isolated from the outside world, Imani's fate was sealed. As the investigation unfolded, police questioned Iman Moss. Initially, he tried to downplay his role. He painted Tiffany as the one who had pushed for harsh punishments, but it became clear he had been complicit. He had seen his daughter grow weaker, day after day, and yet he did nothing to stop it. He had been present when Tiffany excluded Imani from meals, when she was locked away, when her health deteriorated. He had chosen silence and obedience to his wife over protection of his child. Detectives soon learned about Tiffany's prior arrest in 2010 for child cruelty. The incident in which she burned Imani with hot oatmeal was on record, and she had received probation rather than jail time. Child Protective Services had returned Imani to her custody after the incident. Looking back, that moment stood out as a turning point. It was one of the strongest chances the system had to remove Imani from a dangerous environment. Instead, she was sent back into the care of the very woman who would eventually starve her to death. As disturbing details emerged, the case drew media attention. Local outlets reported on the shocking discovery, and soon the story spread beyond Georgia. People were horrified by the idea that a child had starved to death in modern America, in a suburban neighborhood, surrounded by people who might have stepped in to help but did not. Reporters highlighted the failures of the child protection system, the missed warnings, and the fact that Imani had been deliberately pulled from school to keep her hidden. For investigators, one of the most haunting aspects was the contrast between Imani and Tiffany's biological children. Those children were well-fed, healthy, and active. They attended school, received medical care, and were not subjected to the same cruelty. This clear difference underscored how targeted the abuse of Imani had been. Tiffany's decision to isolate her, to deny her food, and to treat her as though she did not belong revealed an intentional pattern. This was not neglect caused by poverty or lack of resources. It was deliberate. Prosecutors began building their case. They collected testimony from teachers, neighbors, and family members. Each piece of evidence added to the picture of long-term abuse. Teachers spoke of how they had raised concerns about Imani's weight and appearance. Neighbors remembered the rare occasions they had seen her, noting how thin she looked. Relatives described how Tiffany and Iman often avoided bringing Imani around, offering excuses that seemed flimsy in hindsight. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. At the time of her death, Imani weighed just 32 pounds. For a 10-year-old, this was shockingly low. Her body showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, and the examiner concluded that starvation had been the cause of death. The evidence left no doubt that this was not a sudden tragedy, but the result of years of mistreatment. As the community learned more, outrage grew. Vigils were held in Imani's memory, with local residents gathering to mourn a child many of them had never met. For those who lived nearby, the knowledge that a little girl had been suffering in silence so close to their homes was unbearable. For teachers and advocates, the case became a symbol of how the system could fail. Despite clear signs of abuse, despite a prior arrest, despite repeated concerns, Imani had slipped through the cracks until it was too late. Behind the scenes, prosecutors knew the case would not be easy. While the facts of Imani's death were clear, they had to prove intent and responsibility. Tiffany, as the stepmother, had been the driving force, but Iman, as the father, had failed in his duty to protect his daughter. Building the narrative of exactly who did what and why would take careful preparation. Tiffany's demeanor during the early stages of the case drew attention as well. She appeared detached, even cold, in the face of the charges. While Iman eventually began cooperating with investigators, Tiffany showed little emotion. Prosecutors described her as unfeeling, unwilling to acknowledge the suffering that had taken place under her roof. For the investigators, the turning point came when Iman began to unravel. Under questioning, he could not hold back the truth forever. He admitted that Tiffany had pushed for Imani to be hidden, that she had demanded the girl be punished through starvation, and that she had insisted on burning the body after her death. His statements gave prosecutors the insight they needed to move forward. The months after Imani's death were filled with hearings, filings, and preparations for trial. Both Tiffany and Iman faced charges of murder, child cruelty, and concealing a death. The weight of the evidence was immense, but the legal process moved slowly. For many in the community, it was difficult to wait. They wanted answers, and they wanted justice for Imani. Throughout 2014 and the years that followed, the case lingered in the courts. Media reports resurfaced periodically, reminding the public of the girl whose life had been cut short. Each time, the story reignited conversations about child welfare, about how many warnings had been missed, and about what could be done to prevent such tragedies in the future. By the time the case finally reached trial years later, the story of Imani Moss had become etched into the memory of Lawrenceville. She was no longer just a name in a headline, but a symbol of vulnerability, of the need for vigilance, and of the devastating consequences of abuse that goes unchecked. As the trial date drew closer, the stakes were clear. For Tiffany Moss, the stepmother accused of orchestrating the starvation of her stepdaughter, the charges carried the possibility of the ultimate punishment. For Iman Moss, the father who had failed to protect his child, His cooperation with prosecutors would determine his fate. And for the community, the trial represented the last chance to see justice served for a little girl whose voice had been silenced long before her death. As the trial of Tiffany Moss approached, nearly 6 years had passed since the death of 10-year-old Imani Moss. The community of Lawrenceville, Georgia, had waited through delays, hearings, and legal proceedings, watching as one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse in the state's history moved slowly toward resolution. The years had done nothing to lessen the horror of the facts. If anything, the long wait only deepened the public's desire for justice. Imani Moss, the father, had already made his decision. Facing charges of murder, child cruelty, and concealing a death, he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. In exchange, he accepted a sentence of life in prison without parole. It was the price he paid for his role, a life spent behind bars rather than the death penalty, which prosecutors could have sought. His testimony would be crucial in the case against Tiffany. He was the one who had lived beside her, who had seen what she had done to his daughter, and who had participated, however reluctantly, in the attempt to cover it up. For Tiffany, the trial presented a different picture. At age 36, she faced the death penalty. She was accused of being the mastermind behind Imani's suffering, the one who had singled her out, starved her, isolated her, and ultimately caused her death. Prosecutors painted her as cold and deliberate, a woman who had decided that Imani did not belong in her family and who had acted ruthlessly to remove her. In the months leading up to the trial, Tiffany made a surprising decision. She chose to represent herself. Despite facing the most serious of charges, she dismissed her court-appointed attorneys and announced that she would act as her own defense. The move shocked many, including legal experts who warned that a defendant in a death penalty case almost always needed experienced counsel. Yet Tiffany remained unmoved. She would stand in front of the jury alone. The trial began in April 2019 at the Gwinnett County Courthouse. The courtroom was tense as jurors filed in, aware of the gravity of the case before them. The prosecution opened with a powerful narrative, laying out the years of abuse that had led to Imani's death. They spoke of a child starved to just 32 pounds, a little girl whose life had been systematically taken away from her. They described Tiffany as methodical and unfeeling, someone who punished a child not through a moment of anger, but through prolonged cruelty. Witness after witness was called to the stand. Teachers testified about how they had noticed Imani's thin frame and had reported concerns. Neighbors spoke about rarely seeing the girl and about the excuses they were given when they asked where she was. Relatives told the court how Imani was kept away from family gatherings. The testimony painted a clear picture. While Tiffany cared for her biological children, she had systematically deprived Imani of food, comfort, and affection. Medical experts presented the evidence of starvation. They explained how long-term malnutrition had weakened Imani's body, how her organs had failed, and how the condition of her remains left no doubt that she had been denied the most basic necessities. It was slow, deliberate, and preventable. Then came the testimony of Imani Moss. Sitting in court, he spoke about the final days of his daughter's life. He admitted that Tiffany had been the one to enforce the punishments, that she had demanded Imani be locked away, that she had insisted on keeping her hidden from the outside world. He described how Tiffany decided Imani would not eat, how she excluded her from meals, and how he had stood by, paralyzed by fear and weakness, unable to challenge his wife. Imani also recounted the moments after Imani's death. He told the jury that Tiffany had insisted on disposing of the body by burning it in a trash can. He admitted his role, helping her carry out the plan even as he felt consumed by guilt. His voice shook as he described placing his daughter's remains into the can, dousing them with fuel, and setting them alight. It was an act of desperation and cruelty that would haunt him forever. Throughout the testimony, Tiffany sat quietly. She rarely questioned witnesses. When she did, her questions were brief, often irrelevant, and lacked the sharpness of professional legal work. To the jury, her lack of engagement seemed to confirm what prosecutors argued, that she had no real defense. Observers in the courtroom described her as detached, even as the most graphic evidence of her stepdaughter's suffering was presented. The prosecution built its case steadily, brick by brick. They showed how Tiffany had treated her biological children with care while starving Imani. They reminded the jury of her prior conviction for child cruelty in 2010, when she burned Imani with oatmeal. They detailed how she had withdrawn Imani from school to cut her off from outside protection. And they presented the horrifying final chapter, the attempt to burn her remains. When it came time for Tiffany's defense, there was little to present. She offered no real explanation for her actions. She called no significant witnesses. She made no compelling arguments to counter the mountain of evidence against her. To many, it seemed as though she had surrendered to the inevitable, unwilling or unable to fight for her life in court. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated, reviewing the evidence and weighing the charges. It did not take long. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was clear. Tiffany Moss was found guilty of murder, child cruelty, and concealing a death. With the guilty verdict delivered, the trial moved into the sentencing phase. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that the crimes were so severe, so deliberate, and so devoid of humanity that only the ultimate punishment would suffice. They described Tiffany as a woman who had intentionally destroyed a child, who had shown no remorse, and who had acted with calculated cruelty. The defense, such as it was, offered little in response. Tiffany again chose not to mount a real case for her own life. While mental illness and her troubled background were mentioned, they were not explored in detail. The jury was left with little reason to show mercy. In April 2019, Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the only woman on Georgia's death row at the time. The sentence was historic, not just for its rarity, but for the clarity with which it expressed society's judgment of her actions. The court had decided that her cruelty toward Imani was among the most serious crimes imaginable, deserving of the harshest penalty allowed under the law. The sentencing brought some measure of closure to the community, though nothing could erase the tragedy. For teachers who had tried to protect Imani, for neighbors who had lived nearby, and for relatives who had asked questions over the years, the verdict was both a relief and a reminder of what had been lost. For child advocates, the case became a symbol of the urgent need for reform, a story told again and again as an example of how the system could fail and how children could fall through the cracks. Iman Moss, serving his life sentence, faded from public view, but his testimony remained a critical part of the record. His failure to protect his daughter, his willingness to follow Tiffany's lead, and his eventual confession had all played key roles in bringing the truth to light. His punishment, life in prison without parole, ensured he would never again be free, a constant reminder of the role he had played in Imani's suffering. For Tiffany, the death sentence left her isolated, awaiting execution in a system where appeals can stretch for years. Her case became an outlier, both for her choice to represent herself and for the rare imposition of death against a female defendant. But for those who remembered Imani, the focus was never truly on the legal proceedings. It was on the little girl whose life had been taken too soon, a child described as quiet, loving, and hopeful, a girl who should have been given every chance to grow, to play, to learn, and to thrive. Instead, she was starved, hidden, and silenced. The theme of Imani's story is clear: abuse, neglect, and systemic failure. Despite warnings, despite a prior arrest, despite visible signs of suffering, she was not saved. Her life ended not because there were no chances to intervene, but because those chances were missed. And while the trial of Tiffany Moss delivered justice in a legal sense, it could not undo the years of cruelty or restore the life that had been lost. In the end, the case of Tiffany Moss and the murder of Imani Moss stands as one of Georgia's most disturbing true crimes. It is a story that forces reflection not only on the actions of a cruel stepmother and a complicit father, but also on the broader system that allowed a vulnerable child to slip through the cracks. It is a story about the devastating impact of unchecked abuse and the heavy price of silence. For Imani, justice came too late, but her story endures, a painful reminder of the responsibility society bears to protect its most vulnerable members, and a call to action to ensure that no child suffers as she did. In 2011, inside a luxury yoga store in wealthy Bethesda, Maryland, two co-workers stayed late to close up. By morning, one was brutally murdered, and the other claimed masked intruders attacked them. But the truth was darker: betrayal, lies, and rage. This is the Lululemon murder. Bethesda, Maryland, was a kind of place that residents often described as calm, safe, and affluent. Just outside Washington, D.C., it carried a polished atmosphere, where upscale restaurants, boutiques, and high-end shops lined the streets. It was the kind of neighborhood where crime felt distant, almost unimaginable. Among the popular retail spots stood the Lululemon Athletica store, known for its expensive yoga and athletic wear, a brand that had developed a near-cult following among fitness enthusiasts. The store became a regular stop for young professionals and students, a place where luxury met lifestyle. But in March of 2011, that serene facade would shatter, and the name of that store would become forever linked to one of the most brutal workplace crimes in modern memory. Two women worked at the Bethesda Lululemon store in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. One of them was Brittany Norwood, 28 years old, originally from Washington State. Norwood was described as charming, outgoing, and capable of making friends easily. She had once pursued a career in soccer, even playing at the collegiate level. Yet, behind the easy smile and approachable nature, there were shadows. Friends and acquaintances would later reveal that Brittany had a pattern of dishonesty. She had been accused of stealing, not just in small instances, but on multiple occasions over the years. These troubling patterns followed her, even into her employment at Lululemon. The other was Jana Murray, 30 years old, from Texas. Jana was admired for her intelligence and her drive. She was pursuing a double master's degree at Johns Hopkins University, balancing her studies with her work at Lululemon. She was energetic, dependable, and often described as the kind of person everyone gravitated toward. She had a close relationship with her coworkers, and she lived a life filled with promise. Her friends and family saw her as someone destined for great things, someone who worked hard and approached life with discipline and kindness. Jana's presence at the store gave a sense of stability and positivity. Both women, though co-workers, were not particularly close. They were friendly, as colleagues usually are, but their lives were very different. Jana was steady and focused, her goals laid out clearly. Brittany, meanwhile, seemed to move between opportunities, often unable to hold her ground for long. Still, in early March 2011, both were working shifts at the Bethesda Lululemon store, often interacting with each other and the rest of the staff in the busy, polished space filled with racks of leggings and athletic tops. On the evening of Friday, March 11, 2011, the store was closing. It was around 9 p.m. when customers left, and the employees began their end-of-day routines. Jana and Brittany were scheduled to close that night, a responsibility that required them to finish cleaning, organizing, and ensuring everything was in order before leaving. For many stores, closing shifts were routine, often quiet, with employees focusing on tasks while chatting or laughing to make the time pass faster. But this night was different. Behind the locked doors of the Bethesda Lululemon, tension began to build. It is believed that Brittany Norwood attempted to leave the store with merchandise she had not paid for. Theft had been an issue with her in the past, though not everyone at Lululemon knew the full extent of those concerns. Jana, committed to following store policies and protecting the workplace, confronted Brittany. Accounts later revealed that Jana discovered Brittany hiding stolen items in her bag. This confrontation sparked an argument that quickly escalated. What could have remained a private disciplinary issue turned into a breaking point, one that neither woman could have anticipated would spiral into horror. Brittany's reaction was explosive. Instead of backing down, she turned to violence. Inside the store, where the shelves displayed high-priced yoga pants and workout gear, an unimaginable crime began to unfold. Jana tried to defend herself, but Brittany attacked with sudden force, turning the quiet retail space into the scene of a prolonged and frenzied assault. She grabbed weapons at hand, objects scattered throughout the store, using at least 7 different tools in her attack. Among them were a wrench, a hammer, and a rope. Jaina was beaten, slashed, and stabbed with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned investigators later. The assault was not quick, it was prolonged, violent, and filled with rage. Jaina endured over 300 injuries, a level of brutality that spoke not of panic, but of uncontrollable anger. When the attack was over, Jaina lay dead. The bright, ambitious 30-year-old's life had been taken in a moment of fury. The store was in disarray, blood smeared across the floor and walls, the scene resembling something out of a nightmare rather than the closing routine of a yoga clothing boutique. For Brittany, though, the violence was not the end. In her mind, there was still a chance to cover her actions. Instead of fleeing, she began to construct a false story, one she hoped would shield her from suspicion. Brittany staged the scene to resemble a robbery gone wrong. She inflicted small cuts on herself, wounds that were shallow and clearly designed to look like defensive injuries. She tied herself up with zip ties, leaving her hands and feet restrained in a way that suggested she had been a victim alongside Jaina. She scattered items to make it appear that intruders had ransacked the store. To complete the picture, she lay on the floor and waited, knowing that in the morning, co-workers would arrive to open the store. The following morning, March 12th, employees arriving for work were met with confusion and horror. The door was unlocked, unusual for a store that was always carefully secured at night. Inside, they found Brittany lying on the floor, tied up and appearing injured. Then, deeper inside the store, they discovered Jaina's body. The shock of what they saw sent panic through the staff and community. A store known for its trendy leggings and bright atmosphere had been transformed into the site of one of the most savage killings Bethesda had ever seen. Police were called immediately, and soon investigators swarmed the scene. At first glance, Brittany's story seemed plausible. She told officers that 2 masked men had broken into the store, assaulted both women, and killed Jaina while sparing her life. She explained her cuts, her restraints, and the chaos in the store as the result of these attackers. In the early hours, detectives considered this version. After all, Bethesda was not a place known for violent crime, and the thought of strangers entering and committing such an attack seemed terrifying, but not impossible. Yet as officers looked closer, small details began to raise questions. Brittany's injuries were minimal, shallow cuts that looked more self-inflicted than the result of a violent assault. The zip ties that bound her wrists and ankles were tight, but not in a way that suggested she had fought against them. And the unlocked store, with no sign of forced entry, made little sense if 2 unknown men had broken in. The case was already beginning to shift, even before the day was over. What started as a story of a robbery gone wrong was quietly transforming into something darker, and investigators sensed it. For the community of Bethesda, the news of a brutal killing inside a familiar store was already hard to accept. As word spread, residents reacted with disbelief. Parents who shopped there, friends who met at nearby cafes, and regular customers all struggled to reconcile the violence with their safe, suburban neighborhood. The Lululemon store was sealed off as a crime scene, reporters gathered, and the tragedy began making headlines. People wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened behind those locked doors, and why Jaina Murray had been subjected to such violence. For detectives, those answers would take shape piece by piece. They had 1 woman dead, another claiming to be a victim, and a crime scene filled with evidence that seemed both chaotic and strangely precise. The challenge was to untangle the truth from the lies, to see through the staged scenario, and to discover who was truly responsible for the horror inside the Lululemon store. As the investigation moved forward, the story Brittany Norwood had told would begin to unravel, and the grim reality of what had actually happened on that March night would slowly come into focus. Detectives began their work carefully, combing through the store for any signs that might confirm Brittany Norwood's story of masked intruders. The initial scene was overwhelming. Blood covered the floor, walls, and even spattered onto merchandise. Jaina's injuries were so severe that even seasoned officers struggled to take in the brutality. Brittany, meanwhile, was transported to the hospital for evaluation, still claiming that two unknown men had tied her up, assaulted her, and murdered her co-worker. At first glance, she looked shaken, but investigators quickly noted how her injuries did not match the savagery of the scene. Jaina had been attacked with unimaginable force, while Brittany bore only shallow cuts and surface bruises. The difference was impossible to ignore. The medical staff who examined Brittany found her wounds suspicious. The cuts were small, neat, and in places easily reachable by her own hands. They lacked the randomness expected if she had been attacked by strangers wielding weapons. Still, detectives did not dismiss her account right away. They began interviewing her, asking for details about the attackers. Brittany described two masked men, one tall and one shorter, dressed in dark clothing, who had allegedly forced their way in. She said they tied her up, hit her, and subjected Jaina to unspeakable violence before fleeing the scene. To investigators, the story felt rehearsed, lacking the small, spontaneous details that usually accompany trauma. But they listened, taking note of every word. Back at the store, crime scene technicians began mapping out the evidence. The blood patterns told a story of chaos and movement. They found trails of footprints throughout the store, marked clearly in Jaina's blood. The prints showed a small shoe size, consistent with a woman's athletic shoes. More importantly, they were identical in shape and pattern, repeating again and again in a way that suggested a single person had walked through the blood. If masked intruders had been present, there would have been multiple sets of prints, multiple directions of movement. Instead, the bloody footprints pointed to one person, moving deliberately through the crime scene. Investigators soon discovered something else. The shoe prints matched a pair of Lululemon sneakers sold in the store. The exact pair Brittany had access to during her shift. This finding began to turn suspicion heavily toward her. If she had been tied up and assaulted, how could her shoes have been the ones leaving tracks through the blood? Detectives pressed harder, and the inconsistencies in her story grew more obvious. She claimed the intruders had argued, yelled, and spoken during the attack, yet the neighboring Apple Store employees, who had stayed late that night, reported hearing no strange voices, only thuds, bumps, and muffled cries. The idea of two men conducting such a loud, violent crime without notice seemed more unlikely by the hour. Forensics continued to chip away at Brittany's version of events. The zip ties around her wrists and ankles had been tightened, but not in the chaotic way one would expect if someone else had bound her. Instead, they appeared carefully placed, as though she had arranged them herself. Detectives reenacted her story, trying to imagine two intruders leaving one woman alive, only lightly injured, while slaughtering the other with such fury. The imbalance did not make sense. Why would violent criminals let one victim survive, especially if she could identify them? Why would they choose weapons scattered around the store instead of bringing their own? The pieces refused to fit together. Attention returned to Brittany's history. As her background was examined, a pattern of dishonesty emerged. She had been dismissed from her college soccer team after accusations of theft. Friends and former acquaintances recalled similar incidents where money or belongings had disappeared around her. In the weeks before the murder, co-workers at Lululemon had suspected she was stealing merchandise. She had a reputation for being friendly, even charming, but her integrity had been questioned repeatedly. The confrontation with Jaina on the night of March 11th began to take on new weight. Detectives theorized that Jaina caught Brittany attempting to take clothing, confronted her, and refused to let the matter go. What may have started as a workplace dispute escalated into violence when Brittany refused to accept exposure. The brutality of the attack on Jaina underscored this theory. Jaina was beaten, stabbed, and slashed over 300 times. 7 different weapons were used, all items found within the store. The sheer number of blows indicated not just an attempt to silence, but an eruption of rage. Jaina had fought back hard, evident from defensive wounds on her arms and hands, but the odds were against her. The forensic team cataloged every strike, every wound, piecing together the last desperate moments of her life. To them, it was clear, this was not the work of two intruders. It was the work of someone Jaina knew, someone who wanted to erase the consequences of being caught. Meanwhile, Brittany tried to maintain her story. She played the role of the surviving victim, giving interviews and recounting her tale of masked attackers. But detectives noticed her behavior was inconsistent. At times, she was oddly calm, even when discussing the horror she claimed to have endured. Her emotions seemed measured, more focused on appearing sympathetic than genuinely shaken. Over time, the weight of the evidence began to crush the story she had built. As the investigation deepened, the turning point came in the form of physical proof that could not be explained away. Among the bloody footprints throughout the store, investigators found clear impressions left by Brittany herself. The tracks matched her shoes, her stride, her movements. It was undeniable. Moreover, analysis showed she had walked through the blood after Jaina was already dead, spreading it deliberately across the store. This discovery destroyed her credibility. The surviving victim was now the prime suspect. Detectives confronted Brittany with these findings, pointing out the holes in her narrative. She denied involvement, clinging to the story of strangers breaking in. But the evidence spoke louder than her words. Each new detail, the lack of forced entry, the shallow injuries, the self-applied bindings, the bloody shoe prints, piled against her. The crime scene had been staged, but not well enough to hide the truth. The portrait of masked men faded, replaced by the reality of a violent outburst between two co-workers, one of whom was now dead, the other desperately trying to cover her tracks. In the days that followed, the Bethesda community was shaken to its core. News outlets covered the story relentlessly, describing the crime as one of the most brutal killings the area had ever seen. Vigils were held for Jaina Murray, honoring her life and achievements, while questions swirled about Brittany Norwood. How could someone so seemingly ordinary commit such savagery? How could a workplace dispute over merchandise end in such devastation? For friends and family of both women, the pain was unbearable. Jaina's loved ones were faced with the reality that a bright future had been stolen. Brittany's family struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the accused murderer being portrayed in headlines. Law enforcement pressed forward, building their case piece by piece. They gathered witness statements, forensic analysis, and timelines of the women's final hours. Prosecutors began preparing for trial, convinced that Brittany Norwood had not only killed Jaina Murray, but had attempted to mislead everyone into believing a false story. Each discovery added weight to their case, until the narrative was no longer about masked intruders, but about a deadly clash between co-workers, one driven by dishonesty and desperation, the other caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the end of the second week, the case against Brittany was overwhelming. She had lied about the break-in, fabricated her role as a victim, and attempted to mislead investigators. Yet despite the mountain of evidence, she continued to deny involvement. The stage was set for a trial that would grip the public, exposing the full story of what had happened inside the Bethesda Lululemon store that night. The truth was ready to come out, and with it, the final unraveling of Brittany Norwood's carefully constructed facade. As the investigation solidified and evidence stacked against Brittany Norwood, prosecutors prepared for what promised to be a dramatic trial. The public was riveted. This was not just another crime in a city. It was a story with every element of shock: an upscale community, a high-end retail store, two young women, and violence on a scale that defied comprehension. Jaina Murray had been a beloved figure, a woman with a promising career and future. Brittany Norwood, by contrast, was now painted as the deceptive co-worker whose dishonesty spiraled into murder. The courtroom would become the final arena where the truth was laid bare. The trial began in late 2011, months after the crime. The prosecution entered with confidence, relying on a mountain of forensic evidence. They described how Norwood had been caught stealing, confronted by Jaina, and then exploded into violence. They presented the bloody shoe prints that matched Brittany's shoes, the lack of forced entry, the self-inflicted wounds, and the zip ties she had placed on herself. They detailed the sheer brutality of Jaina's injuries, over 300 separate wounds inflicted with 7 different weapons. Prosecutors argued this was not a crime of panic or an accident. It was an act of rage, deliberate and sustained. They wanted the jury to see Brittany not as a victim, but as a manipulator who staged an entire crime scene in a desperate attempt to cover her actions. The defense, in contrast, faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was to reduce the severity of the charge. They did not dispute that Brittany had killed Jana. The evidence was too strong to deny. Instead, they argued that it was not premeditated murder. They suggested it was a crime of passion, an argument that began suddenly after Jana confronted her about theft, spiraling into uncontrollable violence. The defense tried to steer the jury towards second-degree murder, which carried a lesser sentence. They emphasized Brittany's emotional instability, suggesting she had snapped under pressure, rather than planned the killing. It was an attempt to save her from life imprisonment. As the trial unfolded, witness testimony painted a vivid picture. Employees from the Apple store next door testified about hearing noises on the night of the murder, thuds, crashes, and muffled cries. They admitted they thought it was just a normal dispute and did not intervene, a fact that haunted them. Co-workers from Lululemon spoke about Brittany's charm, but also about their suspicions she had been stealing. Friends of Jana testified about her bright personality, her ambitions, and the devastating loss of her life. Every day in court was another reminder of the stark contrast between the two women, one a victim of integrity and promise, the other accused of deception and violence. The forensic experts delivered some of the most damning evidence. They explained how the bloody footprints belonged to Brittany and only Brittany. They described how she had walked around the store after Jana's death, spreading blood deliberately, leaving tracks that told a silent but undeniable story. They detailed how her wounds were shallow, inconsistent with an assault by violent intruders. The zip ties, too, were discussed, applied with a precision that pointed towards self-restraint rather than the chaos of a real attack. Piece by piece, the scientific evidence dismantled Brittany's story of masked men. The prosecution also revealed the extreme nature of Jana's injuries. The jury was told that Jana had been alive for much of the attack, fighting for her life. She had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, showing she tried desperately to block the blows. The savage number of wounds, over 300, spoke to rage, not a sudden outburst. It was hard to hear, even harder to imagine, but necessary for the jury to understand the full weight of the crime. Jana had suffered tremendously, and the person responsible sat just feet away in the courtroom. Throughout the trial, Brittany maintained her composure. She sat quietly, often expressionless, listening to testimony that painted her as both killer and liar. To some observers, her lack of visible emotion reinforced the image of coldness the prosecution wanted the jury to see. To others, it suggested a woman overwhelmed, detached from the reality of her situation. Either way, her silence left the evidence to speak louder than her presence. The turning point of the trial came with closing arguments. Prosecutors urged the jury to see the murder as deliberate. They argued that Brittany had a choice when Jana confronted her about theft. Instead of admitting wrongdoing, she chose violence. They emphasized the planning evident in the staged crime scene, the lies told to investigators, the careful attempt to appear as a victim. This was not a momentary lapse, they said, but a calculated effort to escape consequences. The defense countered, insisting it was a crime of passion, born from humiliation and panic, not from cold calculation. They asked the jury for leniency, for recognition of human weakness rather than premeditation. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Brittany Norwood was guilty of first-degree murder. The decision reflected the overwhelming evidence and the jury's belief that the crime was not only brutal, but intentional. For Jana's family, it was a moment of justice, though no verdict could undo the loss. For Brittany's family, it was devastating, the confirmation that their daughter, sister, and loved one would spend the rest of her life behind bars. In January 2012, the sentencing took place. Jana's family addressed the court, speaking through tears about the pain of losing a daughter, a sister, a friend. They described her vibrant life, her dreams, and the hole her death had left in their hearts. The judge, reflecting on the brutality of the crime, sentenced Brittany Norwood to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the maximum punishment available, ensuring she would never walk free again. The courtroom was filled with emotion, grief, anger, and a heavy silence that seemed to settle over everyone present. The aftermath of the case lingered in Bethesda and beyond. The Lululemon store, once a symbol of affluence and lifestyle, was now remembered as the site of horror. For months, shoppers avoided it, unable to reconcile the brand's image with the tragedy that occurred inside. Employees struggled to return, haunted by memories of their coworker and the betrayal by another. The case became a national story, featured in news reports, documentaries, and true crime discussions. It stood out not just for its brutality, but for the deception, the attempt to mislead, the transformation of a victim into a suspect. People struggled to comprehend how a dispute over stolen clothing could escalate into such unimaginable violence. For Jayna Murray's family and friends, the sentence offered closure, but not healing. They continued to honor her memory, remembering her as a bright, ambitious woman with so much left to achieve. Scholarships were created in her name, tributes paid to her character and her passion for life. She became more than a victim. She became a symbol of integrity and promise cut short by senseless violence. Her story resonated not only as a tragedy, but as a reminder of the fragility of life. For Brittany Norwood, life in prison became her new reality. Once a young woman with opportunities ahead of her, she was now defined by the crime she committed. Her name was no longer associated with charm or athleticism, but with murder and deceit. Her attempt to cover her tracks, to play the role of survivor, had only deepened the betrayal in the eyes of the public. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars. Her life effectively ended at the age of 28. The Lululemon murder remains one of the most shocking true crime cases of the decade. It was not a crime committed by strangers or hardened criminals. It was the product of a workplace dispute, a confrontation between two young women in an upscale store in a safe neighborhood. Its horror lay not only in the violence, but in its proximity to ordinary life. It was a reminder that beneath the polished surfaces of communities and brands, darkness can sometimes emerge in unexpected ways. The story of Brittany Norwood and Jayna Murray endures because it encapsulates betrayal, rage, and loss in the most devastating form. It continues to be retold not just as a crime, but as a cautionary tale about the consequences of dishonesty, the cost of unchecked anger, and the lives forever destroyed in its wake.